I was never one to believe in signs. I didn't believe in fate or destiny or anything you'd call divine. But what happened that day, it changed me. It cracked something open inside of me, something I didn't know existed. It started with a gunshot. Sharp, echoing through the forest like a scream in a church. I dropped my axe mid-swing. The wood I was splitting split itself on impact, but I didn't care. My feet were already moving, my breath short, ears ringing. I knew that sound. I'd heard it too many times before. But this one was closer. Much closer. I live in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Deep enough in the woods that cell service is more myth than luxury. The only company I keep most days are birds, bears, and the occasional lost hiker. And that's how I like it. But poachers? There's something else. And they've been getting bolder. I ran toward the sound, crashing through underbrush, boots sliding in the late autumn mud. And then I saw him. The deer. He was lying on his side, chest heaving, one leg twitching uncontrollably. His eyes, my God, those eyes, were wild with pain and terror. And standing over him were two men. Rifles slung over their shoulders. Laughing. Like they just cracked a cold beer at a barbecue. They hadn't noticed me yet. I don't know what came over me. Maybe it was rage. Maybe instinct. Maybe something deeper, older. I reached down, grabbed a rock, and hurled it. Hard. Hit one of them square in the back. What the? Before they could turn their rifles on me, I was already shouting. Screaming. Letting loose every curse and threat I could muster. I told them I had cameras. That I'd called the Rangers. That they were dead men if they didn't run right now. I was bluffing. But it worked. They bolted, tripping over roots, slipping in the mud, swearing the whole way down the hill. I didn't chase them. My focus was on the deer. He was huge. A buck. Antlers like a crown of old wood. Blood pooled beneath his side, leaking slow and dark. He blinked at me, and I swear there was something human in that look. Easy, buddy, I whispered, kneeling beside him. I got you. It took hours. I dragged him back to my cabin using a tarp, inch by painful inch. Every movement made him groan, but he never tried to kick. Never once fought me. Like he knew. Like he trusted me. That night, I didn't sleep. I patched the wound best I could. I'm no vet, but I've mended worse. Kept him warm near the stove. Fed him water with a spoon. Talked to him like he was an old friend. I didn't know if he'd survive. But he did. And when he stood for the first time, wobbly, majestic, defiant, I knew I couldn't keep him. He didn't belong in a cage. Even if that cage was kindness. So I opened the door. Go, I said. And he did. But that wasn't the end. No. That was only the beginning. The morning he left was colder than usual. A heavy frost had crept over the windows of my cabin like silver veins, and the sky was a dull, brooding gray. He stood in the open doorway for what felt like minutes, staring at me. No fear. No hesitation. Just stillness. His breath came out in slow clouds, and his eyes, those deep, silent eyes, held me in place. Then he turned, antlers brushing the frame of the door, and walked back into the forest without a sound. I watched him go until the trees swallowed him whole. I told myself I'd done the right thing. That he was a wild animal and I was just a man. That our paths were never meant to cross for long. Still, when I sat down with my coffee that morning, the cabin felt emptier than it ever had before. Not lonely. Hollow. Like something sacred had passed through and left a silence in its wake. The days stretched on. Winter settled deep and hard across the mountains. I kept to my routines, splitting wood, checking the traps, hunting only when necessary. Every now and then, I'd walk to the edge of the clearing and look out, half expecting to see him there, standing proud in the snow. But the woods stayed quiet. Until the first snowfall in December. That morning, I stepped outside with a mug of coffee in hand, boots crunching over fresh powder, and froze. Tracks. Deer tracks. Not just any his. I'd come to know the shape of his hooves, the pattern of his gait. One of his front legs had never quite healed right, and it left a slightly uneven imprint. There they were, leading from the woods straight to my porch. I followed them with my eyes, heart thudding in my chest. They stopped just feet from the door. He come. Stood there. Watched maybe? Then left. I didn't see him that day. But something shifted in me. I started leaving out food. Apples, mostly. Salt licks, too. At first, the offerings disappeared overnight. Then sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of him just beyond the tree line, watching, always watching, never approaching. But he was there. And then, one evening in January, as I sat on the porch wrapped in an old army blanket, sipping whiskey and watching the sun bleed across the snow, he appeared again. Walked straight out of the trees, slow and calm, his head high. He stopped at the edge of the clearing and just stood there, staring at me. I didn't move. Didn't speak. Didn't blink. He stayed for 10 minutes. then turned and vanished. It became a ritual. Every few weeks he'd come, always alone, always silent. And I started talking to him like he was an old neighbor stopping by. Told him about my day, about the things I missed, about the woman I'd loved once and the silence she left behind. He never responded, but somehow I felt heard. And then, one spring morning, early, wet, and humming with new life, I looked up from my garden and saw not one deer, but 3. He wasn't alone anymore. Beside him stood a doe, lean and elegant, and just behind her, half hiding in the tall grass, were 2 fawns. Tiny, spotted, nervous. He'd brought his family. I don't know what stunned me more, the fact that he came back or that he trusted me enough to bring them with him. For a moment, I just stood there, knees in the dirt, hands covered in compost, heart jackhammering in my chest like I'd just seen a ghost. And in a way, maybe I had. Because something about that moment felt unreal, like a scene ripped out of a dream I didn't know I'd been having. He stood tall, unbothered, still as a statue, but his ears twitched, alert and tuned to the world around him. The doe nudged one of the fawns gently with her muzzle, guiding it forward a few steps before it darted back, too unsure to come any closer. I didn't move. I didn't dare. Any sudden motion and I knew they'd vanish back into the woods like mist. But I didn't have to move. Because after a minute, 2, maybe 3, he took a step forward. Just one. Then another. The rest of his small herd followed. They crossed the field slowly, and when they reached the edge of my yard, right near the old stump I used to split firewood, he stopped. Looked at me. Not with fear. Not with caution. With something else. Recognition. Memory. I sat back on my heels, wiped the dirt from my hands, and simply whispered, "Welcome home." That became the start of a new chapter one never saw coming. They returned every few weeks, sometimes early in the morning, sometimes at dusk when the last light caught their coats in gold and fire. The fawns grew stronger, bolder. They'd sometimes prance through the garden, nibbling at the tomato plants or stepping clumsily over the wooden fence I'd built more for show than for function. I should have been mad, but I wasn't. I was grateful. I started calling him Elijah. Don't ask me why. It just felt right. Like the name had been waiting for him all along. The doe became Clara. The fawns? I never named them. They were wild, untamed, and free. They weren't mine to name. Neighbors, what few I had, started noticing. One of them, old Gary from down the road, stopped by one afternoon when I was fixing the porch swing. "You feeding deer now, Tom?" he asked, nodding toward the woods where Clara and the fawns were visible, grazing on the tall grass. I just shrugged. "They show up. I don't stop 'em." He laughed. "Well, you always were a bit of a hermit. Guess even the animals figured out you're safe company." But it wasn't about being safe. Not really. It felt deeper than that. Like we had some unspoken bond, a silent contract forged in blood and pain and mercy. I saved his life. And in some strange, mysterious way, he was saving mine right back. Because for the first time in years, I wasn't just passing time. I was living again. Looking forward to something. Finding joy in the simplest things: footprints in fresh snow, the crunch of hooves on dry leaves, the glint of eyes just beyond the tree lean at dusk. One evening, after a heavy summer storm, I found Elijah standing alone by the porch, rain still dripping from his antlers. I stepped outside, barefoot, feeling the wetwood under my soles, and just looked at him. He didn't flinch. I walked closer. Close enough to see the old scar on his side, faded now but still there, a jagged reminder of the bullet that should have killed him. I reached out. He didn't move. And then slowly, cautiously, he lowered his head and let my fingers graze his muzzle. It was the first time we'd touched since the day I carried him through the woods. And in that quiet moment, with thunder still echoing in the hills and the scent of rain thick in the air, I realized something I hadn't dared admit to myself. This wasn't just a deer. This was a friend. That summer bled into fall with a softness I hadn't felt in years. The kind of gentle passage of time that makes you forget how heavy life can be. The days were long, golden, warm. The nights crisp but kind. And Elijah kept coming back, sometimes alone, sometimes with Clara and the fawns, who were now almost full-grown, shedding their spots, growing lean and graceful like their parents. It wasn't just a pattern anymore. It was a relationship. A rhythm. A silent understanding that whatever had happened between us had carved a space into both our lives. He didn't need me. Not really. But he came anyway. And I needed him more than I wanted to admit. There were moments, small, fleeting, holy moments, when I'd catch myself laughing alone on the porch as I watched one of the younger deer trip over a root, or when Elijah would give me that look, that slow blink, that I swear carried more wisdom than I've ever seen in another living thing. I started leaving out apples not just as food, but as offerings. Not just out of kindness, but reverence. I fixed the old bench under the pine tree near the edge of the field just so I could sit and wait for them in the evenings, watching the sun bleed down behind the ridgeline. And still, no one believed me. "Tom, you telling me that same buck keeps coming back to your cabin like some kind of dog?" my cousin Walter said over the phone one day. He was calling from Nashville, where he'd lived for the past decade, lost in the noise of city life. "That's insane, man." "Not insane," I said, staring out the window where, right on cue, Elijah stood in the distance, still as ever, watching the horizon. "It's something else." "Like what?" "I don't know," I said quietly. "But it matters." There were other changes too. I started writing again, something I hadn't done since before Linda left. Little journal entries at first, scribbled notes about the deer, the weather, how the forest looked under moonlight. Then longer pieces. Thoughts about memory, about survival, about what it meant to carry pain and still keep moving forward. Elijah became my muse in a way. A symbol. A story I couldn't stop telling myself. And then one early November morning I woke up to something I hadn't heard in months. Gunshots. Not just one. 3. Rapid. Close. I bolted out of bed, heart pounding in my ears, and grabbed the rifle I hadn't touched in nearly a year. Threw on boots. Didn't bother with a coat. Just ran. The forest was still slick with frost. Branches snapped underfoot. Somewhere a crow screamed overhead. I followed the sound, praying I was wrong. That it was just a hunter on public land. Legal. Respectful. But I found tracks. Boot prints. Fresh. Large. 2 sets. And worse, blood. Not a lot. Just enough to paint the leaves in dull rust streaks. I followed the trail for nearly a mile, heart in my throat. Every step felt like a countdown. And when I reached the clearing, I nearly collapsed. It wasn't Elijah. It wasn't Clara. But it was one of the fawns. One of the younger ones. Shot through the hind leg, collapsed in the underbrush, breathing fast and shallow. I knelt beside him, tears already burning behind my eyes. The wound wasn't fatal. Not yet. But it would be if left untreated. And I knew, just as I had once before, that I had to act. That if I let him die, it wouldn't just be a death. It would be a betrayal. Of the bond. Of the trust. Of everything. So I lifted him into my arms. And I carried him home. The weight of him wasn't the hardest part. I carried heavier. Carried logs, stones, bodies from the war. No, what crushed me that morning wasn't the physical strain, it was the fear. The fear that I'd failed them. That all my talk of bonds and trust was just a lie I told myself to feel less alone. His breath was shallow, uneven, and I could feel the tremors racing through his thin frame as I trudged through the underbrush, my boots sinking into wet earth, my legs screaming with every step. My cabin had never felt so far away. And time had never felt so sharp. I kept whispering, "Hold on." Just hold on, over and over again like a prayer. As if my voice alone could convince him not to give in. When I finally reached the porch, I burst through the door, laid him gently on a pile of blankets near the stove, and got to work. The bullet had gone clean through, thank God. No shattered bone. Just torn muscle and blood. A lot of blood. I used the same tools I had from when I saved Elijah, old supplies, sterilized with vodka and desperation. My hands didn't shake. I didn't let them. I cleaned the wound, stitched him up, wrapped it tight. Kept the room warm. Fed him water in slow, careful drops from a plastic bottle. And all the while, I kept glancing at the window, half expecting to see Elijah standing there, just watching. He didn't come that day. Not that night either. But the next morning, just as dawn stretched its fingers across the frost-covered trees, I saw him. Standing in the exact same spot as the first time he returned. Still. Silent. His eyes locked on mine. I stepped outside. The cold hit me like a slap, but I didn't care. I walked toward him slowly, hands out, voice low. "He's inside," I said. "He's alive. I swear it." Elijah didn't move. Didn't blink. But there was something in his posture and alertness, attention, that made it clear. He knew. Somehow he knew. I turned and left the door open. A minute passed. Then 2. And then, God help me, he stepped forward. Not into the cabin. No. He stopped at the threshold like there was some ancient law keeping him from crossing into the world of man. But his eyes drifted inside, scanned the room, found the young buck resting near the stove. I watched his muscles relax, his ears twitch once, and then, with a final look in my direction, he turned and disappeared into the trees. That young deer, he stayed with me for nearly 2 weeks. Never moved far from the hearth. I fed him, talked to him, played old blues records on my dusty turntable while he lay there listening. And slowly he healed. Stronger every day. Until finally, one crisp morning, he stood on his own, walked to the door, looked out into the forest, and paused. I stood beside him. "You ready?" I asked, even though I knew I wouldn't get an answer. And then he stepped outside. I followed him to the edge of the clearing. And that's when I saw them. All of them. Elijah, Clara, the other sibling. All standing in a loose formation, heads raised, eyes bright. They had come for him. They had waited. He joined them without hesitation. But before they vanished, Elijah turned back. Just for a second. And in that look I felt everything I needed to feel. Gratitude, respect, and something dangerously close to love. They were family. Not pets. Not projects. Family. And I knew I'd do it all over again without question. The seasons turned after that with a kind of aching beauty I hadn't felt since I was a boy. Leaves blazed and fell like flames surrendering to wind. The days grew short, the nights long and unforgiving. But something in me had shifted. I wasn't afraid of the silence anymore. I wasn't weighed down by the empty hum of solitude like I used to be. Because now that silence carried meaning. A quiet kind of company. The knowledge that somewhere out there, among the pines and frozen streams and whispering shadows, Elijah and his family were alive. Whole. Watching maybe? Or simply living. And somehow that was enough to fill me. I started paying attention to things I'd long since ignored. The shape of bird calls in the morning. The pattern of frost on my windows. The way deer trails braided through the underbrush like old stories written in a language few remembered. I'd walk the perimeter of the woods each day, boots crunching on dead leaves, and more often than not, I'd find their tracks. Fresh. Just hours old. Sometimes I'd find tufts of fur on a low-hanging branch or the imprint of a body where one of them had bedded down for the night. And every time I saw those signs, something warm would stir in my chest, slow and sure, like the embers of a forgotten fire. That winter was harsher than usual. Storms rolled in one after another, dropping snow by the foot and snapping branches like twigs. I lost power more than once. The woodpile ran low. The generator froze. There were days I didn't leave the cabin at all, just huddled by the fire with a thermos of coffee and my old notebooks, scribbling down thoughts I couldn't say out loud. But even in those dark stretches, I wasn't alone. I'd see them, Elijah and the others, just at the edge of the clearing. Watching. Always watching. Never too close. Never too far. And then one morning, something happened that I'll carry with me until the day I die. I woke to a sound I hadn't heard before. Not footsteps. Not the wind. A different kind of rustling. Slow. Heavy. Unfamiliar. I rose, pulled on my coat, and stepped outside into the cold, blinking against the sharp light bouncing off the snow. There, not 10 yards from the porch, was Elijah. But he wasn't alone. Beside him lay Clara. She was down. Her sides heaving. Muzzle pressed to the snow. Something was wrong. I moved fast, too fast. Elijah tensed but didn't flee. He just watched as I approached, cautious, breath visible in hard, white bursts. When I reached her, I dropped to my knees. She was dying. I didn't need a vet to tell me that. Her eyes were glazed, distant. Her breathing ragged. I saw the blood, a dark, sticky pool staining the snow beneath her rear flank. No gunshot this time. A wound from something else. A predator, maybe? Or a freak accident. Either way, it was bad. I looked at Elijah. My voice cracked when I spoke. I can't save her. He didn't move. Didn't look away. Just stood there watching as I did the only thing I could. I sat with her. Held her head gently in my lap. And waited. It took an hour. Maybe more. And through all of it, Elijah stayed. As if bearing witness was the only thing he could do. When she was gone, I closed her eyes, laid her gently in the snow, and whispered something I didn't even understand. Elijah stepped forward then. Touched her muzzle with his. Just once. And walked away. But he didn't disappear into the forest. No. That night, for the first time ever, he stayed. Right there at the edge of the trees. And kept vigil. With me. The sky that night was impossibly clear, a vault of black velvet pricked with stars, sharp as needles. I sat on the porch wrapped in 2 blankets, Clara's body buried beneath a grove of cedars just before dusk. I'd done it with my own hands. Dug the frozen ground inch by inch, every strike of the shovel echoing like a drumbeat through the still woods. It wasn't just burial. It was ritual. A final act of respect for a creature that had never spoken a word to me yet had somehow filled my life with something I hadn't had in years, purpose. Elijah didn't leave the clearing. He stood sentinel beneath the dark silhouettes of the trees, unmoving, a statue of grief and grace. And even though I didn't understand deer the way I understood people, I knew deep in my gut that he was mourning. I stayed up the whole night, whiskey in hand, not to numb the pain, but to share it. There are moments in life when silence becomes sacred, when words are useless, and the only thing that matters is presence. That night was one of them. Every so often I'd glance toward the woods and see his outline etched in moonlight, proud and still and impossibly alone. I wondered if the other two deer, his children, knew. If they were out there in the dark, waiting. Or if they too felt the gravity pulling everything into this one aching point in time. By dawn, frost had gathered on my beard and Elijah was still there. I stood slowly, stretching out the stiffness in my bones and made my way toward him. He didn't flinch. He didn't back away. I stopped a few feet from him, close enough to see the tiredness in his eyes, the way they glistened in the early light. "I'm sorry," I said. Just 2 words. But I meant them. Every ounce of them. He blinked. And then, as if acknowledging the grief, the bond, the shared helplessness of it all, he bowed his head. Just slightly. Almost imperceptibly. And that small gesture, so quiet, so solemn, hit me harder than any scream. He turned then, slowly, and walked back into the forest. I watched until he was gone, swallowed by the branches and shadows. For days after that I didn't see him. No tracks. No movement. Just emptiness. The clearing felt wrong without them. Like a room with all the furniture stripped away. I busied myself with repairs, chores, anything to keep from sinking too deep. But every time I walked past Clara's grave, something twisted in my chest, a hollow, aching twist of guilt and memory. And then, a week later, he returned. Not just him. The others too. But something had changed. Elijah was thinner. His coat rougher. His eyes harder. The fawns, no longer fawns, kept close to him now, like shadows of his sorrow. They didn't play. Didn't dart around the field like they used to. They moved with caution. Like creatures who had seen too much. Lost too much. And still, they came. They stood in the clearing. Silent. Patient. Watching the cabin. So I stepped outside. Sat on the porch. And watched them back. We didn't need to speak. We never had. Because something deeper than words tied us together now. Grief. Memory. And something close to love. In the days that followed, their visits became more frequent but shorter, almost like check-ins. They'd appear at the edge of the woods in the early morning or just before dusk, stand for a while, and then vanish again into the trees, silent as always. But their silence wasn't emptiness. It was full, heavy with meaning, history, understanding. Elijah no longer stepped into the clearing the way he once did. He stayed just past the boundary in the thin line between wild and known. I think Clara's death reminded him what it meant to get too close. That even here, even with me, there was no promise of safety. No sanctuary immune from the sharp teeth of fate. Still, he came. And every time I saw him, I'd sit on the porch, speak softly, share pieces of my day, what I'd cooked, what I'd read, what song had played on the old radio. It didn't matter that he didn't understand the words. What mattered was the ritual. The presence. The bond that time hadn't eroded but deepened like grooves carved into a riverbed. Winter gave way slowly to spring again. The snow retreated in patches, stubbornly clinging to the shadowed hillsides, and the forest began to breathe anew. Buds burst open. Streams rushed with thawed energy. The world came back to life. But for me, it didn't feel like a return. It felt like something new. Like a slow awakening from a long, dreamless sleep. The pain of Clara's loss was still there, sharp and unyielding, but it no longer hollowed me. It grounded me. One morning, as I was planting early carrots in the garden, I looked up and saw Elijah closer than he'd been in months. Not at the edge of the woods this time. Halfway across the clearing. Alone. He watched me in silence. I stood, brushing dirt from my palms, and nodded once, just to acknowledge him. To my surprise, he took a step forward. Then another. He moved slowly, cautiously, but without fear. It wasn't until he was a mere 10 feet away that I realized he looked different. Older. More tired. His once rich coat was duller now, his stance less rigid. There was a weariness to him I hadn't noticed before, like the weight of years had finally begun to settle into his bones. He stared at me with those ancient, unreadable eyes, and I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Not from fear, but from the quiet truth hanging in the air. He was saying goodbye. Not for the day. Not for the week. For good. I stepped forward. Just once. He didn't flinch. I reached out my hand. Open. Empty. And for the second and last time in our lives, he stepped close enough to touch. His muzzle brushed my fingertips, soft and cold and impossibly real. We stood there like that for what felt like hours. Man and beast, not enemies, not strangers. Just two creatures bound by something unspoken. Something sacred. Then, with the grace he'd always carried like a crown, he turned. Walked back toward the trees. Didn't look back. And I knew. I knew I'd never see him again. The emptiness that followed wasn't loud. It didn't come like a storm or a cry. It came like dusk, soft, creeping, quiet. A slow folding in of everything familiar. I kept going about my life. Chopping wood, cooking meals, fixing the fence that always leaned too far left after winter. But everything felt different. Not broken, just quieter. There was a space now, a kind of silence that settled in the corners of my cabin, in the spaces between thoughts. I found myself watching the tree line more often, waiting without truly expecting, hoping without letting the hope grow too loud. Because deep down I already knew. Elijah had given me his farewell the only way he knew how, with presence, with trust, with one final moment of closeness before the woods reclaimed him. I told myself to be grateful, and I was, for the time, for the connection, for the grace of knowing a creature like him. But grief doesn't ask for permission. It shows up uninvited. It lingers, and in the weeks that followed, it took up residence in me again. Not with the sharp edge it once had, but with a dull, aching weight. The kind that reminds you of what you had, what you lost, and how deeply you felt it. I tried to find purpose again. I threw myself into the land. Started building a new shed near the back of the property. Planted more than I usually would in the garden. Repaired the storm cellar I hadn't touched in years. I even reached out to people, called my sister in Charleston, wrote a letter to an old friend in Idaho. I told myself this was healing, that this was forward motion. But each night as I sat on the porch, I found my eyes drifting to the same place. The edge of the woods where he used to appear. And every time I found it empty, the silence felt just a little heavier. Then one morning, near the beginning of June, I heard it. Not a sound I recognized. Not quite a hoofbeat. Not quite a rustle. Something in between. I opened the door, heart climbing into my throat before I even knew why, and stepped out into the pale morning light. And I froze. Standing at the edge of the clearing were two deer. Not Elijah, not Clara, but their children. The ones I'd watched grow from trembling fawns into strong, wary adults. They stood tall now, regal in their own right, their movements slow and deliberate. And they weren't alone. Behind them, barely visible in the early haze, were two smaller figures. Young, fragile, spotted with white like freshly fallen petals. Fawns. New life. I didn't move, didn't speak. Just stood there as the realization hit me like a wave. They had come back. Not just to visit, to show me, to let me see that life had gone on. That Elijah's line hadn't ended. That even in death, something had carried forward. Quiet and beautiful and full of memory. One of the older deer stepped forward, just a few paces, looked me dead in the eye. And in that moment, something cracked open inside me. Not pain, not grief, something else. Something like peace. They didn't stay long that day. The two young ones wandered clumsily near the edge of the trees, their legs wobbly, heads darting in every direction like the world itself was a new and thrilling mystery. Their parents, Elijah's children, remained watchful, alert, but calm. I didn't dare approach. I knew better. This wasn't an invitation to reclaim something. This wasn't a return to the way things were. It was something far more sacred. A gesture, a message, a legacy walking on four fragile legs. And when they turned to leave, disappearing once again into the tangled arms of the forest, I didn't feel abandoned this time. I felt honored. The next few months were the kind that make you believe in gentleness again. The earth softened. The days stretched long and slow, golden with afternoon sun. I began to see them more regularly, always at a distance, always brief, but enough. Enough to know they were there. Enough to feel Elijah's presence in the way the young buck walked, his shoulders proud and careful. In the way the doe led the others with that same graceful precision Clara used to move with. And in the way the little ones played, carefree, wild, daring, just like their uncle used to, back when he was still unsure of the world. The forest had become a story I now knew by heart. Every fallen branch, every track in the mud, every whisper of movement in the underbrush, it all meant something. I could feel the rhythm of it now like a pulse beneath my feet. Life, death, birth, return. A circle too perfect to be accidental. People don't understand, not really. I had a neighbor, Daniel, who came by one afternoon with a generator part one needed. As he stood on my porch sipping sweet tea, he saw them, just silhouettes in the distance, grazing near the edge of the tree line. "Damn," he muttered. "They really do come around, huh?" I nodded. "They're family." He chuckled, not mockingly, just confused. "You ever think you're projecting?" "I mean, it's just deer, man." I looked him straight in the eye and said, "They came back. After everything. They came back." He didn't argue. Just nodded slowly, like he was trying to understand a language he'd never heard spoken before. It wasn't his fault. Most people only see the world in terms of what they can take from it: meat, lumber, land, money. But some things can't be harvested. Some things are given, offered, gifted, if you're quiet enough, still enough, worthy enough. One late summer evening, as the sky went pink and gold over the ridge, I sat on the porch with my journal open in my lap, pen frozen in mid-sentence. They were back again, the whole small herd. But this time something was different. The younger buck, Elijah's son, stepped further than he ever had before. Into the clearing. Past the old stump. Right up to the edge of my garden. He looked right at me. And I saw it. The same fire in his eyes. The same weight. The same memory. Elijah's spirit, alive and carried forward. And in that gaze, I understood what had truly been passed on. Not just blood. Not just instinct. But trust. A lineage of trust. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat outside long after the stars took their places in the sky, long after the deer had melted back into the woods, long after the crickets and the wind had taken over the world. The journal sat open in my lap, pages blank, as if words themselves had chosen to be silent. My thoughts moved slow and deep, like water over stone, wearing grooves into old memories. I thought about Elijah, not just who he was, but what he had meant. About how a single act of mercy and instinct to save instead of look away had reshaped the very framework of my life. It wasn't just that I had rescued a deer from dying. It was that I had chosen to care, and that choice had rippled outward like 1,000 echoes in the dark. The trust he gave me, it wasn't earned in a day. It had been forged in silence, in watching, in years of showing up. No demands. No expectations. Just presence. That kind of trust changes you. It humbles you. Because it makes you realize how rare it is to be seen by something wild and to be allowed to see it in return. I thought of the young buck who now took cautious steps into my garden. Elijah's son, tall and strong, with the same dark streak near his left eye, the same slow, measured blink that once stilled my breath. And I wondered how much he remembered. If it was memory at all. Or something deeper. Something ancient and wordless, passed from father to son, not in stories but in instincts and impressions. The next day, I prepared something I hadn't in a long time. Apples, sliced clean and laid on a flat rock near the stump. Fresh water in a shallow basin just beside it. A quiet offering. A gesture of continued welcome. Not bait. Not a trap. Just a gift freely given. And they came. Not all at once and not immediately. But slowly, by late afternoon, I saw them gathering near the edge of the trees again. They moved carefully, cautiously, like dancers entering a sacred space. The younger buck approached the stump. Sniffed the air. Looked toward the porch where I sat, still as stone. Then, without hesitation, he stepped forward and took a bite. I didn't cheer. Didn't smile. I just closed my eyes. Because I knew what it meant. He trusted me now. Not the way Elijah did. Not yet. But in his own way. A cautious extension of belief. A silent agreement that I was still part of their world. Still worth watching. Still safe. That evening, I wrote for the first time in weeks. Pages spilled out of me like rain after drought. I didn't write about the deer, not directly. I wrote about grief, about legacy, about how some things can't be taught but must be lived. About how a life can be measured not in years but in who returns to you after you let them go. And I realized something else as I sat there, pen flying across paper, the light fading into the familiar hush of dusk. I was no longer waiting for Elijah to come back. Because he already had. Not in body, but in the way his son stepped into the clearing. In the way I opened the door without fear. In the way we both chose, again and again, to return. Autumn returned like a sigh, curling around the trees and settling into the soil with a kind of wisdom only the forest knows. The leaves turned as they always did, but this time their color felt deeper, richer, somehow, like the whole world had ripened under the weight of what had passed. The clearing behind my cabin took on a golden hue in the evenings, and it became a cathedral of sorts. A place where something sacred had happened and was still happening every time those deer stepped from the trees. I began to feel a rhythm in their visits, a quiet cadence. Every few days, they would come, grazing in the open, moving with a confidence that hadn't been there before. And each time I would be waiting, sitting on my porch with a mug of coffee or a book, never pushing, never calling, just present. The younger buck, Elijah's son, had become a regular now. I took to calling him Ash after the color of the scar-like streak across his flank. He was leaner than his father but taller, and his antlers had begun to take on the same branching, regal shape. He watched me the way Elijah used to, not with suspicion but with a kind of contemplative curiosity. Like he was still deciding who I was. Or maybe what I was. I never approached him, but sometimes he came within 10 feet of the porch, nosing through the grass, ears flicking at every sound, but never startled. That kind of trust is a slow bloom. It grows in layers, each petal earned by silence, stillness, and time. One day in mid-October, something strange happened. I was in the garden gathering the last of the late squash when I heard it, an unfamiliar grunt followed by a sharp, high-pitched bleat. I looked up, heart suddenly racing. It wasn't a sound I associated with danger, not exactly, but it wasn't normal either. I followed the noise toward the northern edge of the property through the rustling underbrush until I came upon them. Ash. And his mate. She was smaller, light-colored, with a gentle slope to her back and a nervous energy that reminded me of the first time I saw Clara. She stood beside Ash, her body angled protectively towards something on the ground. A newborn fawn. So small it looked more like a bundle of grass than a living thing. I froze. I didn't dare get closer. I didn't even breathe too loud. I just stood there, hidden by the trees, watching this new story unfold like a secret meant only for the woods. Ash looked up straight at me. Our eyes locked. And in that moment, I felt the weight of everything that had come before, the bullet wound, the tarp, the long nights by the fire, the burial beneath the cedar, the silence after, the return, the trust. He didn't move. Didn't turn his mate away. Didn't run. He just watched me. And in that gaze, I understood. He was telling me something. That this new life was part of the same line. That Elijah's story hadn't ended, it had multiplied. Spread roots. Borne fruit. And somehow, impossibly, I had become part of that lineage. Not as an intruder. Not as an observer. But as family. I backed away slowly, giving them space. I returned to the cabin in silence, hands trembling, heart full. That night, I didn't sit on the porch. I sat by the fire, staring at the flame, tears in my eyes. Not out of sorrow, but because I knew, without doubt, that something rare had happened. I had been chosen. By creatures who owed me nothing. And had given me everything. The following days blurred into a quiet reverence. I found myself moving slower, more intentionally, as if the forest itself demanded it, like every step, every breath had to honor what I'd witnessed. I didn't return to the spot where the new fawn had been born. I didn't need to. That moment wasn't mine to revisit. It had been a gift, a single glimpse into the continuation of a story I was lucky to have been part of. And I understood now, more than ever, that to be trusted by something wild was to carry that trust with great care, to know when to lean in and when to step back. So I stepped back. And still, they came. Ash continued his quiet visits, though less frequently now. He had a new responsibility, one he carried with a seriousness that was unmistakable. He'd stand at the edge of the clearing, sometimes alone, sometimes with the doe beside him, the fawn no longer quite so small, already finding its legs. They never came close as a family, just enough to be seen, enough for me to know they were safe. That was all I needed. By November, the air had turned sharp again. The leaves were nearly all gone, and the wind began to carry the bite of winter. I spent my days preparing, chopping wood, checking the roof, sealing up the windows. But even in the rush of tasks, I felt grounded, balanced. There was a rhythm to my life now, a harmony between the old man and the wilderness that had never existed before. I had spent years in isolation, and for the first time that isolation wasn't lonely. It was sacred. One night, as the first snow began to fall, I sat by the window, watching the flakes drift and spiral under the glow of the porch light. The forest was quiet, blanketed in white, and for a moment, I let myself wonder. Where were they now? Had they found shelter? Were they warm, safe, alive? The answer came before I even asked. Movement caught my eye near the garden fence. I leaned forward, and there he was, standing alone in the snow. He looked different now. Thicker in the neck, his antlers fuller, his posture heavier. He had grown into himself, become not just a son, but a father, a leader, a protector. I stepped outside, not to get closer, but just to be with him. He didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood in the falling snow, the quiet settling over us like a prayer. He stared at me for a long while, and I stared back, neither of us speaking, neither of us needing to. Eventually, he turned, walking back toward the woods with slow, deliberate steps. But before the trees swallowed him, he paused, glancing back once. Just once. And I knew what he meant. It wasn't goodbye. It wasn't even farewell. It was a promise that this bond between us would never really break. Not with distance. Not with time. Not even with death. Because something had passed between us that was deeper than survival, older than speech. We had kept each other alive. And in doing so, we had become something more than man and beast. We had become legend. Winter came down hard that year. Snow piled deep against the sides of the cabin, covering everything in thick, soft silence. The roads vanished. The trees stood heavy with white, their limbs bowed and brittle. The wind howled through the mountains like an old ghost, shaking the windows at night and stealing heat from every corner of the house. I kept the fire going day and night, a constant dance of chopping, stacking, feeding the flame. It was survival, but not just mine. I left out food more regularly now. Apples, oats, salt blocks, small things maybe, but enough to give the deer a better chance. Felt right, like repaying a debt I could never fully settle. I didn't see Ash or the others often during those bitter months, but I knew they were there. I'd find prints in the snow, fresh and unmistakable, trailing near the porch, circling the garden, leading back into the forest. Some mornings, the apples would be gone, the snow disturbed in just the right way to know they had stood there, close, watching. Trust like that doesn't disappear just because the cold comes. If anything, it grows stronger, it deepens. And so I waited, not in longing, but in quiet companionship with the land and all that lived within it. One morning, after a brutal night of wind and sleet, I opened the door and found a sight that stopped me cold. A gift, lying in the snow, perfectly centered on the porch step, was a single antler. Large, intact. Elijah's son had shed it, as bucks do, but to leave it here, right here on my step, was not an accident. It was deliberate, a gesture, a message. I knelt slowly, running my fingers along the smooth curve of the bone. It was heavy in my hands, warm from the sun that had just begun to rise. The edges were still rough, freshly fallen. And yet it felt like something ancient, something ceremonial. He had left me a piece of himself. And not just of himself. A piece of Elijah. A piece of that first act of trust that had started it all. I carried it inside and placed it on the mantel above the fireplace. No fanfare, no announcement, just reverence. That antler became a relic, not of ownership, not of conquest, but of connection. A physical reminder of a bond that had outlasted seasons, survived loss, and taken root in places deeper than I could name. As winter dragged on, that antler became something I'd glance at in quiet moments. When the nights were long and the fire was low. When the wind roared and I wondered how they were holding up. It reminded me that we were still tethered, still part of the same circle. And then, in late February, something happened that reminded me life doesn't pause just because the cold is cruel. I saw Ash again, but this time he wasn't alone. The young one, the newest fawn, stood beside him, taller now, stronger, though still clumsy in his movements. They stood together just beyond the reach of the porch light, snowflakes falling gently around them like confetti at a funeral. And as I watched, the fawn stepped forward, took 2 awkward, brave steps into the clearing, and looked straight at me. I didn't move, didn't breathe, because in that single look I saw everything. History, legacy, hope. And I knew whatever I had given to Elijah all those years ago, whatever kindness, mercy, or chance at life, I was still giving it now. Not just to them, but to myself. Spring didn't arrive so much as emerge, timid, hesitant, like it, too, had survived a long and painful winter. The snow didn't melt all at once. It lingered in patches, stubborn in the shadows, until the sun finally grew bold enough to chase it away. The first green shoots pushed through the thawed earth like small, defiant miracles. The creek began to run again, whispering secrets in a language only the woods understood. And with that quiet return of life, the deer came too. Ash brought them closer now. Not every day, not even every week, but often enough that their presence began to feel like part of the natural order again, not a rare gift but a woven thread in the fabric of my life. The fawn, his son, or perhaps daughter, I could never tell, had grown taller. More confident. Its legs no longer trembled beneath it. Its movements held a cautious elegance. Still curious. Still wild. But no longer afraid. I would catch them sometimes at dawn, just as the mist curled low over the clearing, stepping softly through the garden rows, pausing to sniff the blossoms or nibble at the new shoots before retreating into the woods again. And every so often Ash would pause longer than the rest. He'd linger near the old stump where I'd left offerings for his father, his eyes scanning the cabin, the porch, the smoke curling from the chimney. He never came as close as Elijah had, not since that snowy night, but he didn't need to. His presence was enough. His silence spoke volumes. And sometimes, in those rare quiet mornings when we stood watching each other from a distance, I'd find myself speaking aloud, not to him, not really, but to whatever spirit still hovered in that space between man and beast. "I see you," I'd whisper. "And I'm still here." There was comfort in that repetition, in the ritual of recognition. Because the truth was, I had come to depend on them just as much as they had once depended on me. Their visits marked time for me now, not in days or weeks, but in meaning. They were milestones of presence, reminders that I wasn't invisible. That the life I had built in this isolated cabin, with its creaking floors and overgrown path, mattered to something beyond myself. And then came the evening I will never forget. It was late April. The sky had just turned the color of old pennies, that soft, coppery gold that means the sun is slipping away. I was on the porch, carving a piece of pine, letting the curls fall into my lap, when I looked up and froze. Ash was there, but not alone. Beside him stood the full herd. Not just the younger doe and the fawn, but others deer I hadn't seen before. At least 5, maybe 6 in total, stepping carefully from the forest, their heads high, their bodies framed in the fading light like something out of myth. And at the center of them all, Ash stood tall, regal, his antlers catching the last rays of sun like a crown forged from fire. It felt like a ceremony. A procession. They walked slowly across the clearing, not toward the garden, but toward the stump. One by one, they circled it. Paused. Bowed their heads. Then moved on. Ash was the last. He stopped in front of the stump, looked directly at me, and then, slowly, deliberately lowered his head. Not in fear. Not in submission. In honor. I set down the carving knife. Rose to my feet. And bowed back. Not out of habit. Not out of some foolish belief that he could understand the gesture in a human way. But because I needed him to know, truly, deeply know, that I understood what he was doing. He was closing a circle. Fulfilling a promise made long ago, under a different sky, in the blood and fire of survival. And he was passing it forward. A torch lit not with flame, but with memory. After that evening, something shifted. Not in them, in me. It was as if the forest had accepted me in a final, quiet way. Not as a visitor. Not as a trespasser. But as part of it. Like the trees and the soil and the creek and the wind had finally decided I belonged. I moved through the woods differently after that. Slower. More careful. Not because I feared disturbing something, but because I understood how much lived there, how much watched. The deer became more than just creatures I'd helped or admired. They were symbols. Mirrors. Living echoes of everything I'd given and everything I'd received in return. Ash's visits grew less frequent in the summer, and I took no offense in it. His herd was growing. His world was widening. That's how it should be. I didn't need them to come often anymore. I just needed to know they could. And they did. Sometimes in the early hours of the morning, I'd wake to the soft crunch of hooves on gravel or the rustle of branches just beyond the clearing. Sometimes I'd find new tracks near the stump or an apple half-eaten on the flat stone I still kept there like a quiet altar. And sometimes on the rarest, most sacred nights, I'd glimpse them moving through the moonlight like ghosts made of breath and bone and memory. It was on one of those nights, deep in July, when the air was thick and the stars shimmered like broken glass, that I finally let go. Not of them. Not of the past, but of the need to hold it all so tightly. I sat on the porch, rocking slowly, the night wrapped around me like a warm, whispering shawl, and I whispered, "Thank you." Not to anyone. To everything. To the forest. To the deer. To the man I had once been and the man I had become. I whispered it like a hymn, a blessing, a surrender. And then, as if in answer, I saw them. Ash. The doe. The young one, now strong, proud, already growing his first velvet-covered antlers. They stood at the edge of the woods, framed in silver light. Ash didn't approach. He didn't need to. He just looked at me. A long, deep look that felt like the closing line in a long, sacred poem. And I knew, as sure as the wind carries seeds through tall grass, that this would be the last time. Not out of tragedy, but out of grace. He had done what he came to do. He had shown me that love could outlive pain. That trust could be inherited. That memory could walk on 4 legs and step gently into your life, asking nothing, giving everything. I didn't cry that night. I smiled. Because I had been given something most people never receive. A second chance at meaning. A story that began with a bullet and ended with a bow. And a legacy that would live in every footfall, every rustle, every silent return. I went to bed with the window open. Let the sound of the woods sing me to sleep. And dreamed not of deer, but of peace. The years that followed unfolded like pages in a slow, well-loved book. Not rushed, not dramatic, just steady, deliberate, filled with quiet moments that stitched themselves into the fabric of my life. I grew older, of course. My hands stiffened in the cold, my back bent a little more with each season. But my spirit, it had never felt lighter. The woods that once seemed like a wall between me and the rest of the world had become my sanctuary, my chapel. And though the deer came less frequently now, Ash and his herd having moved deeper into the forest to places I would never go, I never felt alone. Because I carried them with me. In the rhythm of my steps. In the way I listened to the trees. In the silence that no longer felt empty but rich with memory. That antler still sat on the mantle untouched. I never dusted it, never moved it, never let it be just decoration. It was a relic of something sacred. Not a trophy, but a testimony. Proof that for one stretch of time in my life, the world had made sense. That mercy had meant something. That love didn't always come in words or gestures, but in presence. In return, sometimes I'd see them even long after their visit stopped. Not in the flesh, no, but in the sway of tall grass on windless days. In the sudden pause of a songbird's cry. In the stillness that settled over the cabin just before a storm. I'd glance toward the tree line, half smiling, half hoping, and though no shape would emerge, no hoof would strike the clearing, I'd still feel them. Watching. Remembering. Returning in their way. And then one crisp October afternoon I heard tires crunching on gravel. Visitors. Rare out here. I stepped out, wiping my hands on an old rag, just in time to see a young couple climb from a dusty jeep. The man had a camera slung over his shoulder. The woman wore hiking boots and a curious expression. "Sorry to bother you," the man said, friendly but cautious. "We're doing a little nature photography. Heard there used to be a buck out this way, kind of famous. Thought we'd take a look around." I raised an eyebrow. "Famous, huh?" He chuckled. "Yeah. Locals say he used to come right up to a cabin out here. That he had some kind of, I don't know, bond with the guy who lived here. Sounded like a myth, honestly." I looked past him, out toward the woods, my heart swelling with something old and warm. "He wasn't a myth," I said. "His name was Elijah." The woman smiled, stepping forward slightly. "You knew him?" "I saved him once," I said softly. "He saved me many times after that." They were quiet for a moment, unsure how to respond. Eventually, the man gestured toward the clearing. "Mind if we look around?" "Be my guest," I nodded. They wandered out into the field, cameras ready, eyes scanning the trees for movement that wouldn't come. But I watched them with peace in my chest. Because I knew what they didn't. That Elijah was still here. Not in body, but in every leaf that danced in the breeze. In every branch that cracked beneath cautious feet. In the sacred quiet between one breath and the next. He was here. And he always would be. When the young couple finally left, thanking me with polite smiles and soft handshakes, I stood at the edge of the porch, watching their taillights fade into the distance until the sound of their engine became just another note lost in the hush of the woods. And then I turned back to the clearing. Empty now. Quiet. But not still. No, the forest is never truly still. It breathes. It shifts. It remembers. And as I stepped down from the porch and walked across the familiar grass, each footfall stirred old echoes, memories embedded in the soil like seeds. I stopped at the stump. The same one I had sat near on that first, cold morning all those years ago, an injured buck at my feet, bleeding and broken, life hanging by a thread. I knelt down beside it and ran my hand along the smooth grain of the wood, its surface worn by time, by weather, by the press of hooves and the weight of years. This was the place where it all began. And in a way where it all had returned. The center of the story. The heart. I sat there for a long time. Let the breeze wrap around me, carrying the smell of pine and earth and the sharp sweetness of fallen leaves. My thoughts drifted, not in sadness, but in a kind of mellow gratitude. I thought about Elijah, about the slow and steady way he came back to me again and again. About Clara's quiet strength, the children they raised, the legacy they left behind. About Ash and how he had grown into his father's spirit without ever needing to imitate him. Each of them had been a chapter in a story I hadn't expected to write. A story not about wilderness or survival or even redemption, but about connection. About how one act of grace can ripple outward in ways you may never see. But I had seen it. I had lived it. I leaned back, lying flat in the grass, staring up at the soft blue sky, scattered with clouds that moved like thought. And as I lay there, I let myself remember the hardest parts too, the fear, the helplessness, the grief. I let them pass through me like wind, no longer sharp, no longer something to resist. Just truth. Just part of the journey. Eventually, I stood and made my way back inside. The cabin creaked around me as it always did, familiar and comforting, every board infused with memory. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat by the fire. The antler still rested on the mantel. I reached for it, holding its smooth curve in my hands, heavy with time, warm from the flame. And then, without really thinking, I carved something into the wood of the mantel beneath it. Just one word. Elijah. Not for visitors. Not for stories. For me. For him. For what we'd shared. Because some names deserve to be remembered not with noise or monuments, but with silence. With reverence. With the kind of stillness that listens more than it speaks. That night, the wind returned. Not fierce, but steady, rising and falling like breath. I lay in bed with the windows open, the sounds of the forest curling into the corners of the cabin. And somewhere, just before sleep took me, I thought I heard something soft. A rustle. A step. A pause. I didn't rise to check. I didn't need to. Because when you've known a spirit like Elijah's, you learn that some goodbyes aren't ends. They're echoes. And some echoes never fade. The years continued to unspool gently like an old film strip lit by golden light, grainy but treasured. I aged in that cabin, white creeping through my beard, knees growing stiff in the morning chill, hands no longer as steady with a knife or a pen. But none of it ever felt like loss. Not really. Because I had already been given something far rarer than youth or strength. I had been given clarity. Meaning. I had been a witness to something pure, and that kind of witnessing changes how you carry time. It doesn't weigh you down, it lifts you. Makes each day feel less like a countdown and more like a continuation. The forest taught me that. Or maybe Elijah did. Or maybe they were always the same thing. Each spring I planted less. Just enough to keep my hands in the soil, to feel the earth remind me I still belonged to it. The garden shrank, but the care never did. I kept the stump clear, still left out the occasional apple, though fewer came to take them. That was fine. I didn't do it for them anymore. I did it for the rhythm. For the story that never truly ended. Ash never returned after that final bow with his herd. Not visibly. Not physically. But sometimes I'd find signs, branches bent in that familiar way, prints too large to be anyone else's, antler rubs on the trees near the garden. I never chased them down. Never tried to catch a glimpse. Some bonds are meant to rest quietly, like deep roots underground. I had my moments. I had my story. I had peace. On the colder nights, I'd sit by the fire and read old entries from my journals. Some pages were tear-stained. Others smudged by dirt or time. But all of them hummed with life. Not just mine, but theirs. Elijah's breath captured in ink. Clara's stillness pressed into the margins. The soft scrawl of days when I didn't think I could go on, and the stronger lines that came after when I realized I already was. Eventually, people began to hear about the cabin. Not in a touristy way. Not yet. But word spread. The local ranger stopped by more often. A woman from the Wildlife Foundation sent me a letter once asking if I'd be willing to speak at a conservation meeting. I politely declined. Not because I was hiding the story, but because the forest had taught me that some things don't need an audience. Some truths are too wild to be tamed by microphones and PowerPoints. Still, I wrote it all down. Every bit of it. Not for fame. Not for credit. But for remembrance. So that long after I was gone, someone might find those words and know the world was still capable of grace. That there had been a man who chose mercy. That a buck had returned again and again. That trust, once given, could endure even after death. And one day, I carved one more thing into the mantle beneath that antler. A second name. Ash. Because he had carried the story forward. Because legacy should be honored. Because I had loved them both in the only way I knew how, with silence, with care, and with my whole, quiet heart. The final winter came softly, without drama, without fanfare, just a slow dimming of the world, like the forest itself was exhaling after a long, full breath. Snow settled over the roof of the cabin like a gentle hand. The creek froze early that year, its voice silenced beneath layers of ice. The wind didn't howl like it used to, instead, it whispered, rustling the bare branches with a delicate touch of memory. I moved more slowly through those days, each chore deliberate, each moment steeped in presence. I wasn't afraid. I wasn't bitter. I was ready. There's a kind of peace that comes only when you've made your life a living story and you know you've told it well. I had. Not with words shouted from rooftops, not with crowds or applause. But with choices. With kindness. With listening. And with the courage to open a door to something wild and say, "You're safe here." That kind of love changes you. It roots itself so deeply that even when your own branches begin to wither, the roots hold strong. And they bloom again in someone else, somewhere else, long after you're gone. On one of my last days, I made a slow walk to the stump. The snow was light underfoot, the sky the color of faded denim. I stood there a while, breath clouding in the cold, looking out at the clearing. I remembered every visit, every step, every gaze. I could almost see them still: Elijah, proud and wounded; Clara, graceful and quiet; Ash, bold and solemn; the fawns, clumsy and new. A whole lifetime of hoofprints left behind in my heart. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a final offering, an apple, red and shining like a sun, in my palm. I placed it gently on the flat stone beside the stump, not expecting anyone to come for it, not needing them to. It was the punctuation to a sentence I had spent years writing with my life. That night I built a fire. Not because I was cold, but because I wanted the room to glow one more time, the way it had when Elijah lay on that blanket all those years ago. I sat in the chair closest to the hearth, journal in my lap, a mug of tea cooling on the side table. Outside, the wind picked up, just a little, brushing against the cabin like fingers on old piano keys. I closed my eyes and listened. And I heard it. Soft. Steady. The crunch of snow. The pause. The breath. A presence just outside. I didn't open my eyes. I didn't need to. Whether it was memory, dream, or miracle, it didn't matter. He had come back. Or maybe he had never truly left. And when I finally let go, it was with a smile. Because in the end, we had kept our promise to each other. To return. To remember. To love even in silence. And the forest, quiet and eternal, held that story close, forever whispered in the footsteps of a deer who never forgot.